In this episode of Bee Hooked Knitting, we're going to knit our first hat. My name is Brittany and I'll be your guide throughout this tutorial. For a supplies list and written instructions, please visit knitting.beehookedcrochet.com/beginner-knit-hat. Let's get started. We're going to begin our hat using the long tail cast on. And it's called the long tail cast on because you have to have a long tail in order for things to work out. And you'll only make that mistake once, believe me. What I like to do to estimate the amount of yarn needed for the long tail cast on is I just simply hold on to the tail in my hand here and then just stretch down to my elbow. And I'll count 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll go 5, just for good measure. Now there are more exact ways of estimating this, and we'll talk about that in some of the more advanced tutorials. But for now, we're beginners. This is our first hat, or one of our first hats, and we just want to take things simple and easy. So with that, you want to grab your circular needles. We're just going to be using one for the cast on, so you can just sort of let the other one go. Now I have the yarn just looped around. So off on this side is the end of the yarn, and then coming from here is the skein. So I'm just going to lay that loop over my needle. You can start with a slip knot, but it's really not necessary, and it kind of creates a little bump at the very beginning. So we're just going to avoid that altogether. Starting good habits, right? So when you have your yarn just looped over your needle, take your thumb and your pointer together and go in those loops. Then pinch all of it down at the bottom, just with your ring finger and your pinky, and then spread those two fingers out, so your index and your thumb. So looking at it from here, we have a little diamond. Okay? Once you have that, then we can situate. Now I'm holding on to the loop with my finger because I don't want that to drop off. But I'm just going to just allow the yarn to flow through my fingers while not letting go of it. And I just want to loop around and go under and through and then over. And then just drop that over. Now that looks super confusing, I know, right? So, doing that again, we got our little diamond. We'll go towards us, below our thumb, and out up through the middle. Then grab that other strand back, loop that down, and just release your thumb right over the tip of your needle. That's a cast on. So what we have here is 3 stitches cast on. So speeding it up a little bit, go down and around and through. And now just kind of wiggle this to tighten things up. You don't want your cast on stitches to be too tight, and you don't want them too loose. So you just don't really want to see any space between your needle and your loops. So down, around, and through. Now we want to do that for a total of 44 stitches that we cast on. We see that from a different angle. And just slide the stitches down your needle as you make them. Once you've cast on all 44 stitches, your work should look something like this. So we have just a curling of stitches that's just going to wrap all the way around. What we want to do is stretch them out a little bit. We want there to be some stitches on the other needle as well. So we'll just stretch things out. And then, since we're going to be working in the round and knitting in the round, we want to join with our first stitch here, which is where we just draped that over our needle. Hold your work in your hand so that the tail and the working yarn is coming from the needle that's in your dominant hand. Then we're simply going to stick our needle in that first stitch. So coming from this direction and then going out the other side. That's what we call knitwise. So we've inserted our needle in that stitch knitwise. So there are multiple ways to join knitting in the round. We're going to cover one of the simplest ways, and that's just by knitting our first stitch, and that's just going to hold things together. But we want to add in our tail that we have here so that we have a little extra security. So I'm holding on to those two strands, and then we'll just wrap them around the needle. Then you're simply going to make sure that they stay on your needle, and then slide your needle in this direction. So there I've caught those two loops, and then this is that stitch, and now I'm ready to push it off. So we can just slide that needle down and then pull it off. Now this is our first stitch, and one of the first things that we want to avoid is increasing, and this could be very deceiving since we have two loops here. But what we have is our tail, and that's just adding extra security. So this, for now, is going to count as our first stitch. So go ahead and grab your stitch marker and place it around both of those strands, the tail and the working yarn, just so you know that that is one stitch, and it's our first stitch. Now as we move on to our next stitch, it's important to understand what type of stitch we're creating here. What we're doing is making a ribbing pattern, specifically a 1-to-1 ribbing. So we're going to knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, and so on. That's going to be our repeat. So we just knit one, so our next stitch is going to be a purl one. So I demonstrated how we insert the needle into the stitch for a knit. Here's how we do it for a purl. We just want to take our needle, insert it in the front of that loop. And that is a purlwise. But there's one thing that we need to do. As a new knitter, you're going to have to figure out what is the easiest and most comfortable way for you to knit, to hold the working yarn and to hold the needles and get everything situated. So whenever you're working with purls, you have to have your working yarn coming from this direction. That's very important. It's really easy to add a stitch or to make an increase when you don't really mean to if you don't have your working yarn in the right place. So pull your working yarn to the front, and you can just let it sit there if you're uncomfortable holding on to it. And then insert your needle purlwise, and then wrap that around your needle. And I tend to just hold it there as I'm working that needle around. So there is my loop right there, and now I can just pull that stitch off. I'm done with it. Now that is our purl one. Now moving on to a knit, we need to pull our working yarn to the back again. Insert your needle into that stitch, front to back, and then wrap your working yarn and pull it through. Now you're done with that stitch, so you can pull it off that needle. Now let's do one more purl, and we'll talk about a couple of different ways that you can hold all this and be comfortable, because you're probably thinking at this point that this is going to take forever. It's really not the case once you get the hang of it. So pulling that working yarn around to the front, insert your needle purlwise, so just like that. Wrap your working yarn and then pull it through, and then just pop that stitch off. So we've made our first 4 stitches. Now let's talk about how to make this easier for us. So as you guessed, there are multiple different ways of holding your yarn. I'm going to demonstrate 2 of the easiest. Now when I first started learning how to knit, I knit in this way. And this way is called the American method. And so that's where I'm just going to hold the working yarn in my dominant hand. And I just like to drape it over my finger and then just kind of hold on to it from behind just so I don't lose it. And we'll work on our next stitch. So we ended with a purl, and we know that that's a purl because we have that bar that goes there. So purls have bars and knits have V's, somewhat of a V. So that's another important thing to learn as you're starting to knit, but let's just get the hang of how to hold this stuff first. So we need to do a knit. We're just going to insert our needle knitwise, then take our yarn and loop it around, and then come down. Don't drop that loop just yet. Now drop it from this needle here. So that is a knit working in that American or standard method. So then we just want to pull our yarn to the front because we want to do a purl stitch next. And I just leave that hang. Insert your needle purlwise. Grab that yarn and loop it around. Let me do that again so my hand's not in your way. And then pull it down, keeping that loop, that new loop on your needle, and popping it off the old needle. So I knit like this for a while, and it does take a little bit longer. Now as you advance, there are arguments that say that this is the faster method. But what I have found more comfortable, now if you know my background, you know that I was a crocheter before I was a knitter. So I've always been more comfortable holding the yarn in my non-dominant hand. And I hold the yarn when I'm knitting the exact same way that I do when I'm crocheting. So I'm just going to loop it over. Sometimes I'll wrap it around my pinky to hold on to the tension. So just like this. This is going to be the continental style of knitting. And once you do this, and once you get it to work properly for you, I'm sure you'll have the same eureka moment that I did. So we just finished a purl. Now we want to do a knit. I'm holding on to that yarn in my non-dominant hand, inserting my needle purlwise. Now you have to get some help from your middle finger here. What I do is just hold on to the loop just at the front, just so I don't push it off the needle. And then you can kind of stretch things out. Give yourself a little bit of room to catch that working yarn. It's just right there where you need it to be. And just pull it right through. Don't worry, I'll demonstrate that again. So knits in this fashion for me work so much faster than they do with that other method I just showed you. Now just like with the other method, and anytime we do a purl, we have to have our working yarn coming towards the front. So we'll just situate it so that it's in that direction here. Now there's a little more motion to this. You're going to use your middle finger and a little bit of your ring finger back there, and before you insert your needle purlwise, before you do this, you have to get that working yarn out of the way. Otherwise you're going to end up with an additional stitch or an increase. So you'll just pull that forward. insert your needle purlwise, and then you can just let go and just let it rest up top there, and then use your finger to pull it down again. And that downward motion is just going to keep that loop on your needle as you work through the rest of the motion. So out the back and off. Then we'll just switch that to the back and try that knit again. So I'm just holding it up out of the way. Insert your needle knitwise. Sometimes I tend to twist and move my hands just so that I can catch that working yarn. See how I'm just catching it there? And it's just pulling right out through. So much easier, I think. Now for that purl again, we'll move our yarn, pull it forward, insert knitwise, purlwise, excuse me, insert your needle purlwise, and then finish off your stitch. Now figure out which one of these methods works for you. Go back, replay, so you can see exactly what's going on. And honestly, if this really is your first experience knitting, you might be more comfortable holding the yarn in your dominant hand, and just know that it's going to take you a little bit longer than it would traditionally if you were working in that continental standard method that I just demonstrated. So we've covered our pattern repeat for this first round, and honestly we've covered it for the first 6 rounds. So our ribbing pattern is going to be a total of 6 rounds where we're working in this 1-to-1 ribbing. So what you'll need to do at this point is simply finish up your first row. We'll meet back around, we'll talk about what to do with this first stitch here. So for now, just go ahead and finish knitting your first row in this rib fashion. So knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. And then we'll meet back up on the other side. Now once you've made it back around to your stitch marker, that means you've completed your first round in the ribbing pattern, and it doesn't look like much. But there are a couple of things that we can learn from this first round. So take a look at the texture that we have here. Remember how I said before that purls have bars and knits have V's? There's a bar and there's a V and a bar and a V, and that's a good way how you can tell what stitches you've worked. That was one of the problems I had when I was first learning, was I had no idea what the stitches looked. It's so different than crochet, and I really just didn't pay attention to these little details, and that helped me out tremendously once I learned what they look like. Then I didn't have to try to memorize and say the stitches in my head as I was working them, because if I got distracted, I could just simply look over here. I can see that there's a bar here, and so the last stitch I made was a purl. Now you'll recall that we began our round by starting with a knit, and then we had that goofy little tail looped over the end. So to proceed with our second round, just go ahead and release your stitch marker, but remember that that is one stitch. Then you're just going to insert your needle knitwise under both of those. Okay, so we're not decreasing here, it's just the tail. And then we're just going to finish off that knit, and then we don't have to worry about that anymore. Now I do like to keep track of the first stitch of every round, even though we have our tail here telling the story. It's just easier for us once our hat has some length to it. This is easier to see than trying to pay attention to this. Now that you have a pretty good handle on knitting and purling, and you have an idea of how to work this stitch multiple, the next thing that I need for you to do is finish this round, so this is our second round, and go all the way up to round 6 working in this pattern. So we're going to have a total of 6 rounds where we do the knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. Now keep track of your first stitch as you go, just like we did here. And also pay close attention to what stitches you're making using these bars and these V's to kind of help guide you through the way. It may also be helpful for you to use a row counter so that you can learn how to count the rows. Now we'll talk about that once I have a little bit more. I'll show you how to count the rows. But until we're working to that point, just be very mindful of what round you're on and stop when you're at round 6. And once you've finished round 6, come back to the tutorial and then we'll talk about what to do next. So once you've finished up your 6 rounds in that ribbing stitch pattern, you'll know that you've completed 6 rounds by counting your knit stitches. And I find it pretty simple to just count along one side, but you can count the V. You may find it a little bit easier to count your purls because for whatever reason I find that my purl stitches are a little neater than my knit stitches. So you would just start counting. So we have our V, that would be round 1, round 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And if you're more comfortable counting on this side, you'll just count again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that's an easy way to count your rounds or your rows when you're knitting. So we've done all of the difficult parts in our hat. So from the remainder of the pattern, from here on out, we're just going to be working in knit stitches. And you can continue using your stitch marker to keep track of your first stitch. However, it's really not necessary because rather than keeping track of a number of rounds, we're just going to measure from this point out. We'll cover the knit stitch just a couple more times. You'll insert your needle knitwise, wrap it, and lift it off your needle. And you'll find that this is going to get easier and easier, and you'll find your rhythm. You'll figure out which way holding the needle is comfortable for you. So you may work your knit stitch like I do here, where I'm using my non-dominant to hand off the yarn, and you may find that you're more comfortable working with your dominant hand. Now the cool part about knitting in the round like this is we don't have to join anything. We're really just working in a spiral. So as you work your stitches from this needle over to this needle here, we're just continuing around in the circle. So if you're watching it as it's working around, we're never going to run out of stitches. And that's what makes this so easy. So the idea moving forward and finishing up our hat, what we want to do is continue working the knit stitch just over and over and over until this new section measures 7 inches. So we're going to start measuring from the top of our band and then up to the top of our work. Once that measures 7 inches, then you'll come back to the video and I'm going to show you a really super easy drawstring bind off method. Now it's kind of a knitting hack and it just makes this project that much more easier. You can get really intricate with knitting hats and working with different stitch patterns and decreasing and the dreaded double pointed needles. But since this is a beginner hat, this is probably the first or the second hat that you've knitted, we're going to just keep it really simple. That way you have success with this project and you'll want to start another one. Once you've finished knitting the length of your hat, it should look something like this. So again, I have measured that my work here from the top of our ribbing to where I stopped is about 7 inches. That's going to give us a good length in order for this to be more of a beanie style. Now if you want to convert this to more of a slouchy or have just a little bit of extra room, just go ahead and knit a few more rounds. The longer the length, the slouchier the hat is going to be. So if you want a slouchy, I would recommend maybe you go to 9 inches from the top of your ribbing. But you can kind of play with it and get the result that you want personally. Once you have your length the way you want it, we're going to do a really simple drawstring, and we can't really even call it a bind off method because we're really not even binding off. What we're going to do is take some working yarn, and you're going to want to give yourself a couple of feet, so about 18 to 24 inches or so. You just want it to be able to go all the way around the circumference of the hat. I usually tend to go on the longer side just to make sure I have enough. You'll just trim that off. And then thread that end on your darning needle. So darning needle in hand, we're going to work on our opposite side here. And we just want to take our darning needle and just feed it directly into that first loop. And once we do that, we can safely pull it off of our needle. And then just pull that tight. And we're going to repeat that for every single one of these loops. And you'll have to shift everything around in order to start working these off of your circulars. And you can start working in groups of 2 or 3 loops, whatever you're comfortable with. One other tip is you can leave some of the loops on your needle. If it gets to the point where it's just too hard to pull everything off, you can just work under them. If you find that more easy, then you can do that and then remove all of the loops at once. I tend to find that even though you have to fool with it a little bit to get it off during this stage, it's a little bit easier than removing all of the loops at once. So it's really just a matter of preference. So once you've finished working your tail through all of the loops on your needle, the last step is just to draw it up, and we'll do that by pulling on our tail. And when you get to the end like this, I'm putting a lot of pressure on this, but you really want to be sure not to break the yarn. This is a pretty sturdy yarn, but I have a feeling if you pulled hard enough, you could probably snap it. And if that happens, it really is quite a disaster, because then you'll lose all of those loops that we just fed on to this tail, and then you'll lose all of your stitches, and that is no good. So once you have it closed as far as you can get it, I still have my darning needle on the end here, and I'm just going to work it in a circle around this opening because I want to try to close it up and make sure that it stays closed. And when you do this, it's also going to close up that last little bit. See how there's still a little bit of an opening there? So this is going to help close it up even more, and working it under these loops is going to help it to stay put. I think a good practice when you're closing up the top of a hat like this is to at least make 3 full revolutions all the way around If you have the extra tail, I would go even further. And once you have that worked all the way around, take your tail directly into the center. And you can just kind of leave it there and feel for the needle on the inside of your hat. Once you have it, just go ahead and pull it through. I've pulled it through the inside. And now just turn your hat inside out, and we're going to do that again. So we're going to make a couple of revolutions. Just go all the way around that opening, now on the inside. And don't worry about getting directly under an entire loop. See how I've kind of taken it through the yarn. So there, I really split the yarn there and just pulled it right through. And that is actually desirable when you're weaving in your ends. The messier you weave them in, the more chance they have of staying in place. So when you split the yarn and weave into the strand rather than under it, it will stay in its place better. So you won't have to worry about this working out. Now once you've gone a few times around, you're comfortable that it's secure, I always just go ahead and make a couple of knots. So I've got my tail coming from this side, just kind of go right next to that and pull your yarn through. And before you pull the loop all the way through, you want to feed your darning needle into that loop, and that's going to just create a little knot. And then we'll do that one more time, roughly in the same place. And that's going to help fasten things off. Now when I trim this tail, I don't trim it right at the knot because there is a chance that it could work its way out over time. So I just leave a couple of inches. It's on the inside of the hat. I typically don't notice it. You can weave it in down some of the stitches if you're comfortable, but I feel like this works pretty well for me. So the last thing we have to do is just weave in our tail from the very beginning of our hat. And I'm keeping this on the wrong side because I want to weave this in on the wrong side. And I like to weave it up one of the braids right here. So this is what was our purl stitches. And since there's a lot of bulk there, it's really easy to hide the tail within these stitches. So you can go straight up one side and down the other. And then work it back up through itself. And then you can safely trim that tail off. This wraps up our tutorial on the beginner knit hat. Now if you want to share your projects with me, I'd love to see which colors you've chosen and how your hats have turned out. If you take a picture of your work and use the hashtag BeHookedKnitting on Instagram and Twitter, I'll see it that way. You can also jump over to BeHookedKnitting's Facebook page. That's facebook.com/BeHookedKnitting, and you can post a picture of your project there. If you have any questions, it's also a great place to leave your question and your feedback.